Sangwala Jule. I think Sangwala Jule, welcome back to Shawatales once again. So now from here I will be taking the live forward. So thank you very much for joining us. So Tsundue will be live with us in a couple of seconds. So, Teshtile Tsundue.
Teshtile Jule.
Is everything fine? Am I audible?
I'm good. Yeah.
That's perfect. Sangwala Jule and Teshtile Tsundue. So I would like to welcome Tsundue to first ever open mic literary carnival organized by Ladakh Literary Society for the first time. That too in the time of coronavirus when everyone is occupied and quarantined in their place. So we thought it would be a good idea to bring all the literature lovers to a virtual platform where we can have some very good discussion. So before we start, I would like to introduce Tsundue. Tsundue is a Tibetan poet, writer, and an activist based in Dharamshala. And so far, he has written about 3 books: Crossing the Border, Kora, and Semchuk. Crossing the Border and Kora are a collection of poetry, and Semchuk is a collection of essay. And Tsundue is a one-man army, and he will be always seen trotting the world, advocating for Tibet with his poetry and with his activism. So Tsundue, once again, welcome to Ladakh Literary Society. To all the viewers, I would like to say that if you have some questions, some comment, you can please comment it, and we will try to accommodate as many questions as possible. So Tsundue, once again, welcome. So before we start, so as you are for the first time live with the Ladakh Literary Society, I would like to start with Ladakh and your time in Ladakh. So Tsundue, it is well known that you were in Ladakh teaching at TCB Choglam, sir. So I would love to ask, like, how was the life there and what was your experience in Ladakh?
Yeah, Chule, Tashidilek, thank you very much for having me here with the Ladakh Literary Society and Shawatales. Yes, of course, connecting in this way for the first time. Thank you very much. I am now here in Dharamshala. So ever since the lockdown, I've been here really enjoying my time in reading, trying to get back into writing. But I've been able to spend a lot of time in very good, constructive reading. Ladakh. Ladakh, at that time it was 1996. I was a fresh college graduate. I did my BA from Madras, Loyola College in Madras, and I was a fresh college graduate. Went to Ladakh to teach in SOS, Tibetan Children's Village, SOS Tibetan School. So this was first time me going to Ladakh. And Ladakh for me was completely different from rest of India that I'd seen. So I grew up in Karnataka and partly here in Himachal, but I'd never seen the landscape and people of Ladakh. And when I went there, I thought if I go to Tibet, it's going to be something like this. The people, language, culture, landscape, everything is something that I'd always imagined about Tibet. And it was truly like that. So I was in Choklamsar, SOS school, teaching English. I was 21 years old. I was just a college graduate and really enjoyed being there. So this was my first real connection to Tibet. So for an exiled Tibetan, if we could go closest to Tibet, it's Ladakh.
Okay, Tsundue, that's great. So let me tell you, Tsundue, that I have met like many Ladakhi students like who are of my age or maybe a little bit younger than me, who remember you like teaching them English, and they know you like somehow. Now the situation has changed, but they really remember you because I come across many Ladakhi students. So Tsundula, that's great. And about Ladakh, in Kora, you have written a poetry where you have mentioned Ladakh and how Tibet would have been like Ladakh if you had been on the other side of the border. So would you please throw some light on that poetry, a personal reconnaissance?
Yes. So after my 1 year teaching stint in Choklamsar, the early next year, that was 1997, in the month of March, I went to Tibet. It was a very personal decision for me because I had always imagined Tibet. Being born in India, growing up here, I'd always wanted to see Tibet myself. So Ladakh was one step for me. But then I wanted to go inside, take part in the freedom struggle there. And there was no second thought about being arrested or being beaten or tortured and all the terrible things we hear about what China is doing in Tibet. There was no second thought about it. I really wanted to go and live among the nomads, plan a revolution and do something. So that's how I went from Ladakh, from Leh, from Choklamsar, I went to Nyoma. From Nyoma, I went through Chushul all the way to Kakshung village on the Dumtse border, and then I crossed that Dumtse border into Tibet, and magically I crossed the border without being detected or arrested or apprehended by anybody here on the India side. But once I got there, the people I was supposed to meet at the border were not there. So then I got arrested by the Chinese security after 5 days of walking. So my first real touch and understanding of Tibet was seeing the border. And that was my real connection with Tibet. And 5 days walking in the mountains, Rocky Mountains, like 3,000 to 4,000 meters above sea level, where there was no human being and no food, no water to drink. The entire Indus River was frozen. And I survived in that for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, then I got arrested by the Chinese security. So I was beaten, I was put in jail, I was tortured. I was in a Tibet jail for 3 months. And later they sent me back to Ladakh border and threw me out and said, "You are Indian, get out of here." So I was thrown out. So that was my experience. Through Ladakh, I went to Tibet. So much later, I wrote this poem called A Personal Reconnaissance. So there, I have the book with me. So there is this poem called A Personal Reconnaissance, where I am talking about Ladakh and the borders, or rather the borderlessness. There I'm saying from Ladakh, Tibet is just a gaze away. They said from that black knoll at Dumtse, it's Tibet. For the first time, I saw my country. There's one point where I'm saying, I cross the border. I'm saying, I do not know whether I am there. I do not know whether I am here. Because on the Ladakh side or crossing into Tibet, on both sides, the landscape is same, the people are same, both nomads, taking care of yaks, sheep. So there are Ladakhi nomads on this side, there are Tibetan nomads on the other side. On this side, there are also Tibetan nomads who crossed the border in 1959, 1960, at the time of Chinese invasion, who crossed the Tibet border, came onto the Ladakh side and settled there. So it's the same people, culture, landscape, everything is same. So on the border, there's actually no border. You cannot see the border. So the borderlessness is something that I saw. It was such a poetic moment for me.
So Tsundue, you said like coming to Ladakh was your first step to go to Tibet. So like for a person like me, like it's like impossible to be so clear-minded that you want to get into Tibet, just college pass out. So what is the source of this energy, and what is the source of this clear vision that you had at that moment? So where the inspiration for this clear instincts come from?
Well, I think it's the yearning to see Tibet. You know, for us who grew up on our parents' and grandparents' stories of Tibet. My grandmother, and today is Mother's Day, yeah. So my mother and my grandmother, they used to tell me so much of stories of Tibet. So for us, we were actually nurtured by stories of Tibet. We became Tibetan because the stories of Tibet were so very amazing, and they made us Tibetan. Otherwise, born in India, educated here, we are just like any other Indians here. But it is the memory of my grandparents and parents who told us about Tibet. That inherited memory gave us a sense of identity. And that became a very unique identity. So that unique identity gave us a sense of purpose in life. The purpose that our country is not free today. We have to fight for the freedom of our country, and one day our country will be free and independent. And when I went to Ladakh, I saw how people are truly living in their own country, culture, language. I thought if Tibet is free and independent, it's going to be something like Ladakh. But of course, Tibet is much bigger in terms of size and variations in different cultures also. So Ladakh was in that way a source of inspiration to really live that kind of a culture.
Okay. So Tsundue, like only after that, when you were thrown out of Tibet, then you get into university in Bombay, and then you start writing. So what was that moment in your life when you thought now writing is the only way forward? So would you please show us?
Yeah, thank you. I had always wanted to write, speak. From childhood, I grew up with this great sense of thinking that if we really want to fight for the freedom of Tibet, it's not going to be taking up guns, hide in the jungle and think you are a freedom fighter. That idea of freedom struggle with violence and guns is never for me. And also we knew that freedom cannot be bought by money. Freedom can be only worked for, struggled for, and you get freedom by your own resistance. So that idea of resistance, the method of resistance for me was making your argument. Can you make your argument by speaking? Can you make your argument by writing? And therefore, from childhood, I'd always wanted to write in English, because we know, we speak Tibetan, we write Tibetan, but it stays within the community. I wanted to speak and write and tell the world and argue with China and win that argument. So therefore, I've always wanted to write in English. And so really worked hard. But I'm not one of the gifted students who would remember lines, who would be brilliant in immediately, getting points. I was never that brilliant student, but I was a very, very hard worker. Even in college, when I went to Madras for my BA, it's a common experience for all Ladakhis and Tibetans that we grew up in our mother tongue, and then we are having to understand and acquire the second language, which is English. And how much ever English we have studied in school, it was not enough to be able to be writing or speaking or making that kind of argument. So we had to specially make a great effort to write. And one of the things, I think a common experience between the Ladakhis and the Tibetans, that we study English in school, but our ways of learning the language was never enough to be independent in speaking and writing. So therefore, I made so much of effort in doing my college to start. But I think it really started from Bombay University, where I was doing my MA in English literature, and that was the time when I met some of the best Indian writers in English. So I was very fortunate that I met with legendary writers like Dom Moraes, Nissim Ezekiel, Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre. These are the people I made friends with, and I used to share some of my writings and get some of my writings corrected by them. So in that way, I was in a very good moment when they were still alive, and I was able to share. So I started from there. Then I knew that this is a way which will not only feed me, but it will strengthen my argument, and this will actually become the method to go forward in the freedom movement that I wanted to take part in.
So Tsundue, like in the Kora, you have some wonderful poetries when you were in Bombay and when you were in Madras, and there's a very special. There's a poem called like A Space Bar, which is like quite interesting, where you are looking for a space in a big city. Yeah. So like, and the space is somewhere, I think you're trying to connect it with the home that you are looking in the globe as a Tibet. So how that idea connect to you, and how that poetry came to you when you were in Bombay?
Yeah, so I was in Bombay. I was the only Tibetan student on the campus, Bombay University campus. I was the only Tibetan student. So I started to write. And then what happened, I fell in the company of what is called the Bombay poets. So there is a patch of writers called the Bombay poets. So I fell in the company of that group of people, writers. So we used to be invited to some of the rich people's homes for what is called high teas and early supper, in rich people's homes. So in these homes, we used to have readings and biscuits and cakes and pastries and stuff like that. But I didn't have a place to stay. I was in university hostel earlier. And because I was now doing my second MA, which was MA Philosophy, I didn't have a place to stay. So I used to stay in friends' homes, 1 week there, 10 days in someone else's house. Someone's mother had gone to Pune, so there is an empty bed. So I kept on staying in different places. So I was in search of a place to stay. And then found myself in this unique situation where we were invited to rich people's homes for poetry readings. So when I landed up in these places, I kept on, feeling like saying, "You have such a nice place. Can I stay here?" Kind of blatantly making that kind of proposal. But of course, I couldn't say that openly. So I wrote a poem to propose, "Can I stay in your house?" And I made 20 handwritten copies and gave it to 20 rich friends who had big homes. I'll tell you the results later. I'll read the poem first. So the poem, which was written as a proposal, it's quite a dangerous proposal because this is going to change the naksha of your house. So the poem says, "Pull your ceiling halfway down and you can make a mezzanine for me. Your walls open into cupboards. Is there an empty shelf for me? Let me grow in your garden with your roses and prickly pears. I'll sleep under your bed and watch TV in the mirror. Do you Do you have an ear on your balcony? I am singing from your window. Open your door. Let me in. I am resting at your doorstep. Call me when you're awake. So that is the proposal. And then later, I asked some of my friends and asked them, did you consider my proposal? And they were saying, Tenzin, what proposal? So I was saying, the proposal I gave you in the form of a poem, did you consider? So they were quite zapped about it. So they were saying, oh, I thought it was just a proposal.
Okay, that's quite a creative idea to give proposal to your friend if you want to ask for some help. So, Sundula, as you mentioned before that in Bombay, you are fortunate enough to come across with some of the greatest Indian poets. So, apart from Indian poets and writers, you have mentioned that there are some Tibetan writers like Jayanobu and late Professor Singh Dawa and Lasan Singh, who really inspired you when you were in TCV Dharamshala. So would you please share some of your experience listening to them and how they motivated you to shape you?
Yes, yes. I think for all the writers, aspiring writers for whom English is their second language, what inspires you to write in English and how you get better is constantly you need an example. You need a trodden path you could follow. Because you think your experience is very unique. Your experience as a Ladakhi, living up in the stark naked mountains of Ladakh, where only during summers you have some greenery, and during winter it is just brown everywhere, up in the mountains, in the street, in the dusty lanes, or even the complexions of the people. You know, it's just brown, dusty land. Yeah. So if you are in that situation, now how are you going to write that in English? Similarly, when we were growing up in Tibetan refugee schools, it was a very different kind of experience. And what we were reading in English textbooks, we were reading Daffodils by Wordsworth. We were reading poems written by Robert Frost, or some Hindi poems, or Veer tum bade chalo, Dheer tum bade chalo, you know, that kind of thing. So we were unable to think of that kind of a language to talk about. When I read Jamyang Norbu, when I read Dawa Norbu, Kate Thundub, these are the writers who gave us kind of a trodden path, an example, and felt that with this I may be able to write in English, where I explain, I tell my story, the Tibetan story. So they were truly inspiring for me to think that I can be writing in that way. And then later in college and also in university, I was able to read some of the very good Indian writers where the language is very Indian in nature. So we bust that myth in our mind that English literature has to be stanzaic, metered poetry, classical ways of writing with thou, thee, and kind of thing. When Nissim writes in his poems, where the common language is like, for example, he says, we are like this only. It's a very Indian expression, but it gets into poetry. But if we are to write something like that, we would feel it is such a, it's not important enough. It's not stylish enough to write into poetry. So Nissim desanctified poetry and made it into common people's language. I was, as a student of literature, for me, language is important. And even today, I consider myself, and I am a student of language. So as a writer, I constantly follow language, and I look for new ways of writing, new ways of expression. So language is important for me. And that's how I started to write some of the poems that I've been able to do.
So Tsundue, that's very true, because like it's my personal experience. Like when I went through Tibetan writers, I felt that why I was reading Shakespeare and why I was reading other Western writers, because like in their poetry or in their work, I was not able to find myself. When I came to Tibetan writers, I could associate myself with the character, because you have the character by the name of Tenzin or by the name of Dolma. So that was like something very wonderful. And even I jokingly shared with some of my friends that maybe now we should introduce Tibetan poets or writer into our syllabus, so that we Ladakhis can learn something from Tibet, and we can like work on it and make it our Ladakhi literature, so that we can start writing in English. So I was talking about somehow Ladakhi somehow to make the English more Ladakhi. So, and hopefully I think now with the university that we got recently, maybe we will be able to incorporate some of Tibetan writers in our syllabus. That's a great hope, and it would be a great learning experience. So Tsundue, you mentioned about languages, and right now when you look at Tibetan literature as a whole, you have Tibetan writing in English, writing in Tibetan, and writing in Chinese. So how do you look at Tibetan writing in so many language, and what makes it Tibetan literature and what doesn't make it Tibetan literature? Would you please throw some...
Yeah, so that's a very important question. When we look at the borders of literatures, where does it belong to? How Ladakhi should Ladakhi literatures be? If a Ladakhi writes in English or Hindi, or in that way Ladakhis living in America and Canada and Europe writing in Western languages, languages in Spanish or German or Portuguese or Japanese or whatever, in different languages. So what makes a literature? How do we define it? I would think firstly the content is important. Content. What is the content of the literature? One. Two. What is the language of the writing? When I say language, it's not just English or Hindi or Tibetan or whatever. There is an inwardly there is another language of talking about it. For example, Jamphel, your English, Tenzin Tsundue's English is not the English of the British or the Americans or the Australians. We speak English in a very different way because we have received English in our own respective cultures. So therefore, Indian English has become now a different genre completely on its own. It's become classic, and in Indian English, people are winning awards. Some of the best awards are won by Indian writers. So therefore, firstly, it is important to understand our own nativity, our contents, our language, our metaphors. Now, when I talk about Ladakhi literature or Tibetan literature, there may be foreigners who are talking about Ladakh, but that does not make it Ladakhi literature. There are many foreigners who have written about Tibet, but they do not become Tibetan literature. But a Tibetan writing in English needn't necessarily be again Tibetan literature. The content and the language makes literature the defining moment. So therefore, there are, for example, poems written by Tibetan woman writer Wesir, Tsering Wesir. She now lives in Beijing. But I would consider her writings in Chinese Tibetan literature. because the taste is Tibetan, because the content is Tibetan, because the language is Tibetan. Only the thing is the physical language is Chinese. Yeah, or in exile Tibetan writing, there are writers like Pujung Di Sonam, Thiring Wese, Tenzin Diki, and the elder generation from there, so Jamya Nurbu, Dawa Nurbu, Ke Thundub, Gewo Tsiring. There are a number of those writers. So although these are written in English, these are essentially Tibetan literature. So this is the contribution we are making, that we are writing in a new language, but it has become Tibetan literature. So Tibetan literature bulk is there in Tibetan. At the same time, a new crop of writings in English has become Tibetan literature. And so similarly, I could see, so for example, Haskip has come out with his book of poems, yeah. So similarly, in that way, more and more new writings are going to come about, and they will also challenge traditional ways of thinking. Can we think of Ladakhi literature only in Bodhi script, or can we think of Ladakhi literature in English and Hindi? Yeah. Now I see that in Ladakh, for example, number of people speak fluently in Hindi, so they may be writing in Hindi, but the content and the language may essentially be Ladakhi. So these are going to be Ladakhi literature written in Hindi and also in English.
Yeah. Okay, great, Sundula. I think with Tenzin Laskyap poetry book, I think that's the first step of Ladakhi towards Ladakhi English literature. And recently, Gyalpo has also come up with Beti's Butter Tea. And I think many more will follow. And I think Tibetan English literature is a very nice example for us to look up to and learn. So, Tsundula, right now you mentioned about Husserl and some Tibetan writers who write in Chinese from Tibet. So, I just wanted to ask, like, what are the traits or the content of exile writer like you, different from the writers who are writing from China or of Tibet under China? So what are the traits that make it different?
I think our experience, the lived experience, define our writing. For example, my friend Pujung Di Sonam. Pujung Di Sonam came from Tibet when he was 5 years old. He grew up here. But he has memory of his life in Tibet when he came from Tibet at that time. Yeah, so he has memory. I have no real memory of Tibet because I'm born in India, educated here, and raised here. While Verser is mixed, Chinese and Tibetan mix. But she considers herself Tibetan. She writes, poetry, voicing the Tibetan mind. So these are very important literature in 3 different spaces. Verser writing in Chinese from Beijing about Tibet and essentially adding on to Tibetan literature. Pujung Di Sonam, born in Tibet, came into exile and had never been able to go back to Tibet, writing in English. I am born and brought up in India, educated here. Of course, in between, I went to Tibet, I got arrested and jailed there. That also helps me in articulating a very different experience. So it is our lived experience that defines our ways of writing. So for me, as an exile, otherwise when we just generally look around, especially if you come to Dharamsala, you will not feel anyone who's crying or who's just about to die, that kind of, strenuous, bustling experience. You don't actually get to see at the facial level. But deep in the heart, among the exiled Tibetans, we know that we had been uprooted from Tibet. And we cannot go back. We are here in India. like my parents who came from Tibet, and I'm born in India, but we are not able to settle down. Deep in our heart, we are unable to settle down. We keep on thinking that we're going to return. Maybe after 5 years, maybe after 10 years. We kept on saying this. So we are unable to settle down. Yeah? So we cannot go back to Tibet, we are unable to settle down. Now what about our future? Because of the overwhelming Chinese political power, military power, financial power, resolution of the Tibet issue does not seem to be coming anytime soon. So therefore, future looks bleak. So for an exile, you had been uprooted, unable to settle down, you don't see a future. That is the angst, that is the existential threat that we all feel, and all Tibetans in exile. However, they are able to smile through all this anxiety and make a living and keep on postponing our life after every 10-15 years of planning and thinking. We have been here in India as refugees now for 61 years. Yeah. So, but it gives a unique strength, and that unique strength comes from being Tibetan and also being Buddhist. Great sense of self-confidence that wherever we may be here in India, or Tibetans living in China, or in Beijing, or Tibetans living in Tibet under the Chinese occupation, or Tibetans living in Europe, America, wherever we are, our sense of identity as Tibetan, as Buddhists, has given us a very deep sense of confidence. Wherever we may be, we will be okay. We are not the ones who are going to die, go begging, that kind of. We know that we are so very strong from inside, and we will survive, we will live through this. And we need to bring that change in Tibet and in China. So this gives us a real strength of our personal character, and also bring in a sense of resilience in the movement also. So these are things we get to see in the literature and also in our ways of preserving our religion and culture.
Great, Tsundue. I think this is where your collection of essays, Semshuk, comes in, because basically in Semshuk you're talking about how not to lose your hope and keep trying. Even if the future is very bleak, don't lose your hope. And you're talking about the practice of non-violence, which is much more harder than violence, because in non-violence you don't have to lose your focus. Even if someone hit you, even if someone provoke you, you have to stand still and you have to keep pushing. I think in Semshuk you were trying to explore this idea for Tibetan, and you are talking to the Tibetan not to lose hope, if I'm right. And Tsundue, and in Kora, there's a very beautiful poem called, I think, My Tibetanness, where you are making we are looked upon as Chinki, Manipuri, or Naga. But I think you have not mentioned Ladakhi, because I think we Ladakhi also go through the same thing, because when we are in the mainland India, we are also treated in the same way. And I think all Ladakhis can really connect to these phrases, this section of the poem. Would you throw some light on it and share it with them?
Yes. Immediately, my immediate response is, for me, whether you are Ladakhi or Tibetan or Munpa in Arunachal, I don't differentiate. We are essentially the same kind of people, language, culture, and same Yishinurbu. Yeah, we are same. Yeah. Now the difference is Ladakhis today have become Indian citizen. Politically, it is part of India. Yeah. Otherwise, culturally, we are same people. So I don't have to mention Ladakhi separately. Yeah. But Manipuri, Naga, Japanese, Chinese, of course, these are different. but common experience that we feel in India is a sense of discrimination. So therefore, when people look at our kind of face, Jamphel, your face, my face, when we go to Delhi or Bombay or any of those places, people immediately say, hey, ching chong ping pong or momo or something like that. So it's a common experience, yeah. But then, with that kind of experience, you cannot go out to fight every day. So I have mechanized a way of responding. So instead of fighting back, I just make fun of it. And in fact, in one of my poems, I've written, I'm more of an Indian except for my chinky Tibetan face. Yeah. So and as His Holiness the Dalai Lama very often says that the Tibetan Buddhist culture has come from India. And it is Indian mind. And if our mind is full of Indian culture, which is Buddhism, then accept that we are all Indians. Of course, I know the Indians do not accept us because we look very different. Yeah, so they keep on saying ching chong or now corona and that kind of thing. So I think one easy response is to laugh at it instead of getting angry. Yeah. So what it does is it protects you from getting irritated or getting angry. I think that's the advantage of giving a Buddhist response, laughing at it, or neutralizing it by saying, like, हमने आपको पाकिस्तान ने बोला नहीं बोला ना हम नहीं बोलेंगे आप नहीं है हम सब Indian है so in a technically neutralizing manner, one can speak in that way. So I think, how you respond in moments of crisis, in moments of tragedy, truly shows your culture. The strength of your culture comes about at the time.
So Tsundue, wonderful. Like my favorite poem from the Kora is like the betrayal, because like where you mentioned that my father died, and like somewhere you mentioned that but we are Buddhist and people say we should be peaceful and non-violent, and I think this is also a feeling that Ladakhis can connect, because like in my student experience, like I have also traveled to some places, and like they treat us like आप तो लद्दाखी हो आप तो बिल्कुल लड़ते नहीं हो आप अच्छे हो आप जवाब भी देते हो and then at times come, and I think here you are somehow mentioning like connecting to the Lopez term about the prisoner of Shangri-La, maybe I think so I think that's something very wonderful, like, and very deep loaded. So would you please recite this poem to our viewers? I think that would be a wonderful experience.
Okay, so this poem is titled Betrayal. So it says, my father died defending our home, our village, our country. I too wanted to fight, but we are Buddhist. People say we should be peaceful and non-violent. So I forgave my enemy. But sometimes I feel I betrayed my father. Yeah, so there is this valorizing and romanticizing of Tibetans and Ladakhis being Buddhists, and there is a great sense of unrealistic expectations of us, that we are expected to be like the Dalai Lama, So of course, His Holiness is our Guru, he is our Buddha and whatever, but we cannot be expected to be acting like him. We know how angry a Ladakhi or a Tibetan can be. Yeah, we get frustrated, we fail, we get angry, we put up a fight. We are as dirty as any human beings can be. Yeah, so we cannot be expected to be Buddhas. But of course, that kind of stereotyping is there. And when such kind of unrealistic expectations are being made, especially being Tibetans under Chinese occupation, 1/6 of Tibetan population being killed and decimated, Tibetan religion, culture suffering. Even today, under Chinese occupation, Tibetans are losing their language. Young Tibetans are not given the right to study Tibetan language. Tibetan textbooks in Tibet are being replaced by Chinese textbooks. And still we are expected to be peaceful and non-violent and all of that. That is in the kind of expectation, kind of a stereotyping from outside. But I through many years of experience as an activist, I know that being stereotyped is one, but true practice of Buddhism, both for Ladakhis and for Tibetans, or even Mönpas in Arunachal, there is a strength in this. And I know I've seen this. As an activist, I've been beaten, tortured. I've been to jail so many times. 16 times. 16 times I've been to jail. Yeah. So many times I've been beaten. Sometimes, you are stripped naked and you are made to do uta beta, really, humiliating kind of experiences. Yeah. And worse is not going to jail or getting beaten. Worse is standing in the court. You are made to attend court cases for years and years and years. One case in Bangalore went on for 11 years. And I had to go to Bangalore from Dharamshala via Delhi 37 times. And at the end of it, it was just nothing. Yeah. So you feel how difficult it is, having to attend a court case for 11 years, 37 times. Yeah. So this is the testing time when you have to undergo this. Protesting is just a small moment, half an hour, 10 minutes, sometimes even just a maximum 1 hour, protest. But having to undergo this court case for 11 years is the true test of time. And there is the true test of you as a Buddhist. Your sense of patience is tested. Your sense of calm is being tested. And therefore, if you are able to maintain your sense of calm and your peace of mind, it doesn't matter whether you go to jail or whether you are either are in lockup in the police station or locked down like now. If you have peace of mind from inside, it doesn't matter whether you are in or out. It doesn't matter. That is the true practice of Buddhism. Yeah, and that will show in our character. And it doesn't matter what people expect of us. What really matters is we as Buddhists, are we practicing this? And we must, because our practice of love and compassion is the true source of our happiness. And happy Ladakhis, happy Tibetans, and it's a possession, it's a prize. Yeah, and it is much more valuable than all the money and weapons put together. And therefore, Tibetans have no respect for Chinese in the way they are building their military empire, because we don't value that kind of military empire. We don't value that kind of, financial empire with which they are trying to buy Africa and South America. And whatever they're doing, we have no respect for that, because we know the true sense of peace and calm and your happiness comes from your practice of love and compassion, your capacity for patience and forgiveness of the other.
So Tsundue, now it's time to take some questions from the viewers. So like the first question is by the impulsive finger, and her question is like, how would one define the sort of boundary between Tibetan and Ladakhi literature and the ones written by the Western writers?
Oh, okay. Firstly, let us look at Western and Tibetan Ladakhi put together. Yeah. So Western, they look at Tibet and Ladakhi experience, history, religion, culture, and therefore they write from outside. While Tibetan literature, Ladakhi literature, we write as a Tibetan, as a Ladakhi. So we are writing from the inside, our lived experiences. Yeah. Now, between Ladakhi literature and Tibetan literature, we need to see, firstly, realistically, Ladakh is a small territory. It is now a union territory. Physically, it's a smaller area. And Tibet physically is much, much bigger. It's like 2.5 million square kilometers of land and much larger population and varieties of different dialects, sub-dialects. So many different sects of Buddhism and also Tibetan Christian, Tibetan Muslims. And in the eastern part of Tibet, there are intermarriages with Mongols, with Chinese, with Bhutanese, with people in Arunachal. Yeah, so of course, in terms of size, capacity, different. So therefore, types of different ways of writings are also different in that way. But essentially, literatures are the lived experience people are talking about, either the past or how is it now, or the aspiration of a people. So I remember when I was in Ladakh, I've written a couple of poems in Tibetan, and these seem to be talking about, for example, in the flora fauna. It was very limited, but I was talking about willow trees and poplar trees, just basically two types of trees in Ladakh. Yeah, so you're referring to your atmosphere, your surrounding, your kind of people. So I think these are the defining moments. And then politically, of course, I'm sure there are going to be poems written about Ladakh having its own entity as a union territory, and therefore your expectations, yeah, or losing the statehood may be another sources of inspiration in writing. And of course, then between Ladakhis and the Tibetans, even in the past there were wars fought in between the Ladakhis and Tibetans, and so all these gray areas or intersectionality will also come about. Yeah, so because there are these kind of mix up of history, and one of the reasons why Ladakh lost Aksai Chin, yeah, Aksai Chin, which is now India is claiming, it used to be an extended area between Ladakh, Aksai Chin, and Tibet. It was nothing to do with Punjab, the state, or India today. It's between Ladakh and Tibet. But there was a war between the Ladakhis and Tibetans, and ultimately it went to Punjab, the state, and today it's under Chinese occupation, but India is also making it. So territorially, there are so many of these intersectionality where history, today's claim, people, these areas can also be talked about, yes.
So Tsundue, let me remind you that we are running out of time.
Yeah.
So before,
Okay.
so we still have 8 or 9 minutes. So
Okay.
now, coming to the politics thing. So now, how do you look at the China and Tibet relation in the post-corona world? Because the corona has, in one way or other, changed the world politics. So how do you look at it?
Yeah, firstly, Tibetans have been saying that China has occupied Tibet. China is lying. China has rewritten its history, its narrative to say China had always been this big empire. But in reality, China is a country that emerged as a free and independent country in 1911 after overthrowing the Manchus who used to rule over China. And no one wants to listen to us because they are, are wanting to trade with China. They just want to have trade with China. So they don't want to listen to anything else and accept whatever China has been saying. So China then had the advantage of becoming one of the biggest countries in the world, having Tibet, East Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria all together, and also having control over Hong Kong and threatening Taiwan. So these are the things that we have been politically been saying the world did not care. So, but then that covering up, that changing of narratives, if it had become a habit for China, and therefore the real reason why an epidemic of COVID-19 became a pandemic, because China was trying to control the epidemic within China, but did not stop Chinese from going to Italy, Spain, the UK, United States, and many other countries. They were stopping people to travel within China, but they allowed them to go out. It became a pandemic. That is the reason. Yeah. So now countries around the world today are saying China underreported, China hid evidences, China erased evidences, China lied, and therefore all these so therefore I think relationships between China and internationally so many different trading companies, trading partners are already changing. It's going to be a very different world. After 1 year, China's position will be very, very different. And these Western countries who may then have to fight with China may actually use Tibet, East Turkestan, and Mongolia for their own advantage to criticize China or to make points with China. But a true change will happen if the people of China start to question their government and start to question all the standard narratives China has created, and therefore one China policy that India also accepts, one China policy that internationally all these countries who trade with China, that will also, if that comes about a change, then truly, there will be a change. And I think that is already happening, and many companies in China are today migrating to various other countries, and some of them may come to India. So India may gain more leverage against China because it's going to be a destination for many of the investments from Europe and Americas. So the dependency on China's supply chain will change, and that will also change the political dynamics with many other countries. So I think the world will be very different after the end of all this lockdown and the COVID-19. It will be a very different change.
So Tsundue, the last question, because this question has been repeated so many times. So you have just 1 minute. So many youth of Ladakh are very interested to know about your lifestyle. So the way you dress and so just 1 minute.
Yeah. I've really simplified my life into just 2 pairs of clothes, a shirt, black Tibetan black shirt, and pair of jeans. I have 2 of them. I wear them in turns, and this is how I've simplified and minimalized. I live in a house paying room rent of 2,500 rupees. My budget for a month is 5,000 rupees. I have no savings, but I'm okay living with this. I have this book of poems which I sell for 50 rupees, and this pays for my food and room rent. So I live very simply, and this simple ways of living is my source of happiness and my strength to fight for Tibet, because I believe that if I am free, then I can free my country. So I have freed myself from all the usual mundane aspirations of life, like bank balance and money and house and family and all of that. I liberated myself from that. So therefore, I'm a free man. I'm a happy person.
So Sunila, thank you very much, and that was a very enlightening session. And we hope Tibet will be free one day and big yellow. And we would like to have you in Ladakh reading poetry. And I hope very soon in your
I would love to come to Ladakh. I go to Ladakh quite often. I'd love to come, and I wish I can lead a creative writing session. I'm sure there are many people who want to write. I wish I can do something like that.
Yeah, very sure, sir. I think now the time doesn't allow us, but in future, we'll do that for sure. Thank you very much, Sundula, Tuche,
Okay,
Regalo.
thank you,
Sorry.
Jule.